everyone, you may be seated.
All right, what do we got? More video?
Yes, Your Honor, with these next two witnesses, it'll be a short video. It's just going to be segments of some of the videos that have already been introduced.
Okay. All right, I'll have to reposition you guys too, I guess.
Have we approached all the juries that we have?
Yeah.
Jurors are in the courtroom, Your Honor.
Thank you.
You may be seated. Jurors are present and accounted for, Your Honor.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for returning. Were you all able to abide by my instructions during the recess? All right, we're going to get started again. Looks like the board's out again, so state if you want to reposition. I'm going to reposition. Who is your next witness?
The defense would call on Michelle Simpson.
Thank you so much. The screen. Turn to face the clerk and raise your right hand.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this call to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Good afternoon, Ms. Simpson.
Hi,
Please state your full name for the record.
Dawn Michelle Simpson.
Ms. Simpson, would you please tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury how you're employed?
Currently, I'm retired from banking.
Okay, and back in January of 2014, specifically January 13 of 2014, can you tell the jury how you were employed there?
I was in banking at the time. I was a teller supervisor.
Okay, and how long had you been in that particular industry?
A total of 27 years.
Okay. I am going to direct your attention to that day, January the 13th of 2014, and ask you if you had an occasion that afternoon to go and visit the Cobb Theater.
I'm sorry, you...
Did you go to the Cobb Theater
Yes.
that day?
Yes.
Okay. I know you're a little nervous, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I want you to relax.
Okay.
Nothing to be nervous about. I'm just going to be asking you some questions, okay? You had an occasion to go on January the 13th to the Cobb Theater.
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury why it was that you were at the Cobb Theater that afternoon?
Well, I had taken a personal day from work, and my daughter was looking for movie posters for her room, and that's why I went to the theater, just to ask for movie posters.
So you had gone to the movie theater in order to try to retrieve some posters for your daughter's room.
Yes.
Okay, I am going to show you an exhibit that is exhibit number 1, introduced into evidence in this case. And I'm going to ask you to step down if the court will permit me.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me move to.
You're probably good right there. We'll be able to see on this big screen. I don't think you need to get any closer right now. I'm going to show you a portion of exhibit number 1 that's been introduced into evidence. Go ahead, Mark. Matt. You stop it there, right there. Ms. Simpson, do you recognize the individual that is there at the counter of the Cobb Theater?
Myself, and I believe that's the manager.
This is you here?
Yes.
Okay. And this is the manager that you had approached that afternoon?
Yes.
Okay. Continue, Matt. Stop it right there, Matt. Do you recognize the individual that just walked up to the counter?
Mr. Reeves.
And do you recognize Mr. Reeves here in the courtroom? Can you please point out to Mr. Reeves here in the courtroom? And can you tell us what he's wearing?
A gray jacket and burgundy tie.
Okay. Your Honor, let the record reflect that she is identified Mr. Reeves. And so when Mr. Reeves first walked up to the counter, did you notice anything about him that would have given you an indication that he was angry or mad or anything of that sort?
No.
And so you continued to talk to the manager concerning your request?
Yes.
Matt, would you continue? Okay, stop there, Matt. Now, while you were speaking to the manager there, could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury of what you noticed of Mr. Reeves at that point in time?
Well, I just noticed that he was off to my left. He was not behind me, he was to the side of me, a few feet away from me.
Did he interrupt in any way, shape, or form what you were discussing with the management?
No.
Did he appear to be patient and courteous in this whole process?
Yes.
Go ahead, Matt. Can we stop there for a second? Now, you moved over to one side of the counter, is that correct? Mm-hmm. And could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you were doing when you moved over to one side of the counter?
I was going to make out a list of the posters that my daughter was looking for to leave with the manager.
Okay. And even though you were doing that, were you in earshot of the conversation that Mr. Reeves was having with management there?
Yes.
And were you able to witness Mr. Reeves' disposition as he was having that conversation there with the manager?
Yes.
Okay. And could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury whether you noticed anything that gave you any indication that Mr. Reeves was upset or mad or anything of that sort?
I didn't observe that, no.
And did you observe him being courteous and pleasant while he was discussing the matter with the management?
What I observed, yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Matt. Stop there. In that segment of the video, it appears you look over towards Mr. Reeves, correct?
Mm-hmm.
To make your observations of what he was doing and how he was doing it. Is that correct?
Objection, eating.
Sustained.
Is it true or not that you looked over there to make your observations? Is it true or not?
Yes.
It is. Go ahead. Stop there, man. It appears that you continued after Mr. Reeves left the counter. Is it true that you continued talking to management?
I don't recall if I said anything else to management.
Did you get the posters that you wanted?
No.
Okay,
They
can you
didn't
tell
have
the ladies and gentlemen of the jury why not?
They didn't have them.
Okay. And so what did you do at that point in time?
I decided to just leave, and I was gonna come back at another time and see if they had more posters.
You may take your seat. Matt, you can... Now, you left that day, and where did you go?
I went home.
Okay, and on your way home, did you see any law enforcement cruisers?
Yes.
Okay, and when you got home, tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you did.
When I got home, I turned on the TV, which is not abnormal. I do that when I get home. And breaking news was just going off the television. And I had seen enough to know what was going on, that I was just there. So I got on my computer.
To find out what was going on
happened.
in the cop
Yeah.
theater? Okay. And did you obviously realize that you were just there?
Yes.
Okay. And so what did you do? Did you call law enforcement that day from your home?
I did, but I had called my mom first.
Okay. And what, without telling me what your mom told you, did whatever conversation you had with your mom result in you calling law enforcement?
Yes.
Okay. And did law enforcement contact you back?
Not that day, no.
Okay. Did they contact you back, period?
A detective did,
Okay.
Yes.
And was that in person or was that telephonically?
telephonically.
Okay. And so a detective contacts you telephonically, and was that, did you have an interview with that detective?
Just over the phone.
Okay. And did you tell the detective what you told the ladies and gentlemen of the jury here today?
Yes.
Was that interview between yourself and the detective quite short?
Yes, it was short.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Mr. Escobar or Mr. Funderburg, could you turn that off when it's not in use?
It has to reboot, that's part of the problem, and can you turn the screen?
Okay, just the
Okay.
screen, thank you. Okay, Cross?
Yes, ma'am. May it please the court, counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Mrs. Simpson, good afternoon, ma'am. Mrs. Simpson, you would agree with me that when you were standing at the service desk and you indicated you saw Mr. Reeves walk up, correct?
Yes.
Did he exhibit any signs of urgency?
No.
And what I mean by that, you were standing there, did he tell Mr. Peck, excuse me, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I have an urgent matter that I need to discuss with you?
He didn't say that, no.
Okay.
Those words.
In fact, did you ever hear Mr. Reeves indicate to Mr. Peck that there was an individual in the theater cursing at him?
I didn't hear that.
Did you hear him say that he had been threatened?
I didn't hear that either.
Did you hear him say that there's imminent violence, that he needed him to come into the theater right away?
No.
He didn't say any of those things, did he?
No. Not in those words.
In fact, he never told Mr. Peck that, quote unquote, he was scared shitless.
I didn't hear those words, no.
Okay. May I have a moment, Judge?
You may.
I have no further questions, Your Honor. Just
Read it right. Yeah, go ahead.
Ms. Simpson, was Mr. Reeves speaking softly, normally, there at the counter?
A normal voice that I heard, no.
He certainly wasn't speaking like this.
No.
I have no questions.
May this witness be released?
Yes, Judge.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, ma'am. You're free to go. Who's next?
Your Honor, the defense would call Thomas Peck.
Okay. He's not talking, it's okay.
Okay.
I have to get my shoes resoled.
Okay.
You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I feel like this was a rerun, huh? Good afternoon, Mr. Peck.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Peck, would you please state your full name for the record?
Thomas James Peck, Jr.
In an effort to get to know you a little better, would you tell us about your educational background?
I attended the Culinary Institute of America, graduated as a chef, and it's basic.
Okay. In 2013, were you employed at the Cobb Theater?
Yes, I was.
And specifically on January the 13th of 2014, could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what position you held there at the Cobb Theater?
I was the general manager.
Okay. And would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that means as a general manager? How many people do you have under you, and in what capacities?
I have about 9 managers under me and about 80 or so employees
Okay. And that Cobb Theater was located where?
in Wesley Chapel.
Okay. Now, there at that particular theater, you have different offices, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you also have a section that's called the Cena Bistro, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And was the Cena Bistro opened on the time slot of this particular incident?
No, it was not.
And it's my understanding that in an effort to get into the Cena Bistro area, do you have to go through an elevator?
Yes, elevator or stairs.
Okay. And that is a separate location that is only for Cena Bistro patrons?
Correct.
So in other words, if you're in the general seating, you just can't go up there just because you want to?
Correct.
Okay. It's only for those guests that have paid for that particular service?
Yes.
And at this time, you're saying, the day of the time of this incident, it was non-operational?
It was not operational, no.
Okay. Now, tell me a little bit about the Cena Bistro. How many theaters do you all have there?
6.
Okay. And how many rooms would you say you have in the entire complex?
16.
16. Okay.
Auditoriums?
Yes,
Yes. Okay.
16, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in addition to that, you have some offices that, your office, is that correct?
Correct.
And where is that office located?
It would be, as you're coming into the building, be to the left-hand side, down by past theaters 1 through 9.
Okay. And do you have some offices upstairs as well?
Yes.
Again, what offices are upstairs?
The manager's office, projection IT tech office, server room, and yeah, that's it for offices up there.
And at the time of this particular incident, you had a surveillance system in place in various parts of the complex, is that correct?
That's correct.
And one of those particular areas was Theater 10, is that correct?
That's correct.
And did those cameras capture the entire general population area of Theater 10?
No,
It covered just a very small, limited portion, is that correct?
that is correct.
Those cameras were positioned where in that theater?
They were positioned in the upstairs balcony for the Cinebistro side.
Okay, was that pretty high up in the wall, like 30, 35 feet up?
I would be guessing, but yes, I mean, it could be
Okay.
there.
Okay. Now, you had some capabilities of being able to see that particular surveillance system from various parts of that theater, is that correct?
Yes,
And would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury all of the different areas that you could have actually accessed that surveillance system to be able to view it?
one access area would be the general manager's office.
And where would that be at?
That'd be down by theaters 1 through 9, down that side, downstairs.
Okay,
And then one would be the IT projection booth,
okay.
or
And that-
office.
And that IT projection office was located where?
Upstairs, past the Cinebistro theaters, to the right, I would assume.
Okay. And what is housed in that IT room?
In that particular room, there's DVRs, the text PC, and chair office equipment and stuff like that, and other wiring and stuff for the projectors.
So all of the DVRs for that surveillance system would be up there in that IT room?
Yes,
Okay. And you've indicated, I think, that you could see that surveillance from that room as well?
yes, you can.
Okay. Do you all use that capability, the capability of being able to, either from your office or from the IT room, to view surveillance that is taking place throughout the complex?
Yes.
And would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury some of the reasons that you go on to the surveillance system to see what's going on?
Yes, we would look at it for instance, if somebody had their phone out or something for recording, if somebody was, if there was a situation we need to assess, if somebody was taking something from our concession stand, monitoring our POS systems, point of sale systems for our own staff to make sure monies are being counted right and also change are being counted right. And just if we have any other incidents, we have to look up, like, again, somebody in a theater that doesn't belong in a theater or something along that line.
Okay. And so, did you use that capability of your surveillance system to view often?
Yes, yes,
Okay, and so you were familiar with the operation of it, correct?
yes, yeah, the basic viewing operation, yes.
Your other managers were also knowledgeable about operating the system?
Yeah, somewhat.
Okay. And even some of your non-managers were experienced in viewing the system, correct?
Yes.
Now, in viewing that system, are you able to actually see the time stamps of when things are happening?
Yes, you can.
Okay. And so you're able to actually look at the surveillance system and then know when those things that you're viewing are taking place?
Based on the timestamps, knowing that timestamp, yes.
Okay. Now, I would imagine in the past, when you've had instances, and correct me if I'm wrong or right, if you needed to have a police officer view video for something that may have occurred in a theater, you've provided that access to law enforcement, correct?
Yes, we wouldn't refuse it, yes. I mean, yes.
That's, you, at times, at that theater, have law enforcement present there, do you not?
Yes, we did.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury when you have law enforcement present and when you don't?
At that time, we had law enforcement present on weekends, like Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays.
So just Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays?
That's correct.
Okay. And certainly they would have had access, like you would have access to that room upstairs, the IT room, as well as your office, if they needed to view video?
Yes, if they requested it, absolutely.
What about corporate, Cobb Theater corporate? Did they have access in a way to likewise view remotely what was taking place at each of the camera areas of the Cobb Theater?
Yes, they could dial in.
And what does that mean, just so that the ladies and gentlemen of the jury are clear on what that means, dial in?
They could dial in remotely through like computer to computer talking. I couldn't tell you the technical terms, but they can dial in where they can pull up the computer, take the computer per se, and we would recognize that because the background screen would turn black from blue, and we'd know they were watching it. So.
Okay. And would corporate do that from time to time?
Yes, and from time to time they would, yes.
But not real often?
No.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that particular day, and I want to talk to you a little bit about lighting conditions there at the theater, if I can.
Okay.
There's a segment, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a segment where commercials are played in the theaters. Is that correct?
Yes, that was.
Okay, and what are those called?
30 minutes prior to trailers, we have NCM. Which was National Cinema Media, and over time it's changed names, but it's NCM at the time, and they basically just show advertisements. Local companies can buy advertisement space and just show commercials, and once in a while you have a little quick movie push put in there too. But
now during that segment of the experience, what are the lighting? What's the setting of the lightings during that experience, the commercial experience?
we would call that level 1 full house lighting.
Level 1 full house lighting.
Yeah.
Okay, and then after these commercials are concluded, what comes on next?
You'll get a couple PSAs, public service announcements, and then it'll go into the trailers.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those public announcements. Is there an announcement that comes on that is telling the audience to turn off their phones and put their phones away?
Yes, there's one about being courteous, having your phone off.
And why is it that the Cobb Theater has that particular announcement go out prior to the previews?
Just to be courteous to the guests, to other guests who are when they're watching movies. There's nobody on their phones and stuff like that.
What is the goal of the Cobb Theater when they're inviting individuals to come and see movies? What's their goal?
To provide a great guest service experience for all.
And so that announcement comes on. Is it just visual, or is it visual and audio as well?
It's visual and audio.
Okay. Meaning that you're seeing illustrations on the screen that clearly tell someone, turn off your phone, and there's also a voice telling someone, turn off your phone.
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you have some sort of monitoring process that you all use to make sure that that theater experience is preserved for the paying customer?
Outside of, we would have hopefully our ushers doing proper theater checks, which they'd walk up and down the aisles, make sure everybody was, in their seats doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Is that what you have trained your ushers to do in looking for individuals that were not abiding by that particular rule at the Cobb Theater?
Yes, at the right timing, yes.
Okay. And what would happen if an usher were to see someone violating that rule by using their phone in the theater?
Depending on the timing of it, they would be asked to please refrain from using your phone.
And if that individual, for whatever reason, told that usher, I'm not going to do it, what instructions did you give your usher as to what they were to do under those circumstances?
They would notify a manager to ascertain the situation.
So they were trained to notify a manager to handle that situation from that point forward?
Correct.
Okay. And you would be a manager?
Yes.
That they would come to? Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
And you had other managers that they would come to as well?
Yes.
Were you trained by Cobb Theater as to how to handle that situation once that happened, meaning an usher came to you and said, hey, there's some guy, I approached him, he doesn't want to turn his phone off. Were you trained by Cobb Theater on how to handle that matter?
Yes.
And so what would be the next step? You've been told now that a patron has refused to turn off their phone. What is the next step in processing in order to preserve the paying customer's experience?
We would go in there and again ask the guest, whether it be manager and the usher or just the manager, would go in there and ask the guest to please turn off their phone.
Okay, and what if the patron said, I'm not going to do it?
Again, depending on the timing of what was going on the screen, I mean, we would then ask the guest to please step outside and we would discuss it with them.
Okay, and what would happen if, in fact, the patron didn't want to do that?
Well, then we'd have to accelerate it upward to law enforcement.
Okay, and so if you were not able to accomplish what you were trained to accomplish in that circumstance, you would then contact law enforcement?
Correct.
Okay. How long is that announcement telling people to turn off their phones?
I would say 20, 30 seconds, somewhere around there.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where you were on January the 13th of 2014, just prior to this incident taking place.
Okay.
And let me ask you one more question about phones. Having the phone out and texting on that phone, is that still a violation of your policy?
Yeah, at certain times when the lighting's at a certain level, it would be, yes.
Meaning previews?
Yes, we would look at it.
Now, where were you immediately prior to this incident taking place?
I was at the guest service desk.
Okay, Matt? Your Honor, I'm going to be asking Mr. Peck if he could step down. Is that possible?
Judge, may I move, please?
Mr. Peck, if you could just stand here, then not in front of any of the jurors, but maybe right here, so that you can see the screen. I'm going to show you what's been entered into exhibit as exhibit number 1, into evidence as exhibit number 1. And I'm going to play a segment of that and tell me if you recognize what's being shown on this exhibit. Go ahead, man. Stop. Now, Mr. Peck, do you recognize the individual that is seated here?
Yes, that's myself.
That is you?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recognize this young lady here that is standing there talking to you?
Yes.
Okay, and tell me what was taking place at that time as you appeared to be having a conversation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what was that conversation about?
I believe it was about, she was asking for movie posters.
This young lady was asking for movie posters?
Yes.
And what instructions were you giving her in an effort to accommodate her request?
To write down what movie posters she was interested in and phone number, contact information, stuff like that.
And you were going to try to get those posters for her?
We would try.
Okay. Go ahead, Matt. Okay, stop right there. Now, Mr. Peck, you recognize this individual here that approached your desk here and is situated in the video as you can see him?
Yes.
And do you know who that is?
Yes, that's Mr. Reeves.
Okay, and do you see Mr. Reeves here in court?
Yes, I do.
And would you please point out to Mr. Reeves as to what he is wearing?
He's seated right there, gray jacket, red tie, white shirt.
Okay. Now, go ahead, Matt. Stop. Now, did you notice anything while you were having this conversation with this young lady that caused you to be interrupted at all by Mr. Reeves?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. Did it appear that he was waiting there patiently while you were finishing your conversation?
By viewing it, yes.
Okay. Go ahead. Okay, stop. Now, it appears that now you're having a conversation with Mr. Reeves. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. At any point during that conversation, did you get any feeling that he was angry, upset, mad, anything of that sort in the conversation you were having?
Not that I recall.
Go ahead, ma'am. Okay, stop that. Now, during that entire conversation, did you have any exchange with Mr. Reeves where you believed again that Mr. Reeves was mad, frustrated, angry, or anything of that sort?
Not that I recall.
Did he appear to be polite in the conversation that you had with him?
I don't recall the conversation, but, I mean, looking at the appearance, yes, it appears fine.
If he had been mad, upset, or what have you, is that something you think you would remember?
I would think so.
Okay. And so it appears that he looked back at one point in time in the conversation. Is there a sign that says Theater 10 right behind where he's positioned?
Yeah, it would be up right outside the auditorium, so.
And it's right number 10,
Mhm.
that's right under the door
Yes.
as you go in. Okay. You may take your seat.
Go ahead, Mr. Escobar.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Peck, shortly after that conversation that you were having with Mr. Reeves, tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what takes place next.
Next thing I can recall was that somebody came around out of the theater and said he shot him, call 911.
Okay. And so you initially tried to call 911?
Yeah, I tried calling from the landline and was not successful at that time.
And what was wrong with the landline at that point in time that it was not successful?
It just kept ringing, and plus also I hung up as it kept ringing because I figured I needed to be more mobile.
Okay, and so what did you do in an effort to be more mobile?
I took my cell phone and started walking towards the auditorium and called 911.
Okay. Did you in fact reach 911?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And after speaking to 911, did you stay there in the front lobby area or did you go into Theater 10?
I was moving towards Theater 10. Guests were coming out, and I was talking with guests as they were coming out, trying to keep them calm as I was making my way towards the theater.
Okay, and please tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you were trying to do in order to keep these guests calm.
I'm just trying to tell them, relax, please calm down, just giving reassurances, just having some of my staff members help them, have them sit down, have them calm down if they can, as I headed towards the
Why
auditorium.
were you doing that? Did it appear to you that they were emotional and frantic?
Objection leading.
Why is it that you were doing this?
There was, it was a lot going on, a lot of commotion, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of people anxious and emotional about it, I would guess, yes.
Okay. And so, what are you doing physically in trying to calm that down?
Nothing physically except for just like whether it's, kind of guiding them to a chair or talking to them, instructing staff members to hand them a drink of water or something, whatever I could as I make my way towards the auditorium.
Okay. And so you made your way to the auditorium with your phone in your hand?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury exactly where you went once you made that turn.
I went into the auditorium 10, walking down the right-hand side of the hallway, and took a left around the, I guess it's the wall, and started walking up the stairs
Okay. And what was your purpose in doing that?
to let 911 know what was going on at that time and to see what was going on as well.
Were you talking 911 at the time?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And so you get up those stairs and tell me what you're doing once you reach the top of those stairs.
First, I noticed Mr. Oulson on the floor, unfortunately, and then I also noticed somebody, Mr. Reeves at the time, now I know who he is, sitting in a chair with somebody, I don't know if he was to his right as I'm facing him, maybe to his left, with the hand on his shoulder.
Okay. At that point in time, when you noticed Mr. Reeves in that back area, did you notice where his hands were?
I think at one point he was wiping his brow, and his one hand was down by his side, but he was wiping his brow, his face.
Okay, you don't know which hand that was?
No, I do not.
In your conversations with the operator, did you indicate to the operator that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, something to the effect that the assailant was still there?
Yeah, I said something like that. They said, because they were asking about the where the weapon was, and I said the weapon's been detained and the assailant is still there.
Okay, did you get a response from that statement?
Something to the effect of "Don't call me that" or something along that line.
What about "I'm not the bad guy"?
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, I would say.
I object. It's 403. It's not a nuisance.
It's a statement. Now, Mr. Peck, following that conversation with 911, did you contact corporate?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury how it was that you contacted corporate there from your building.
On my cell phone.
Okay, and did you advise corporate of what was taking place?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, obviously you were aware that there was a surveillance system that was in place, correct?
That's correct.
And did you, at that moment, go and view the surveillance system yourself?
No, I did not.
Do you know if corporate was actually utilizing their remote capabilities to view the surveillance system?
I heard they were, yes.
Well, did you not only hear that they were, did you see that they were?
I did not witness that, no.
Okay. So, let's talk about that. You now have a lot of police officers that are arriving at the Cop Theater, correct?
Yes.
And there was quite a few, were there not?
Yes, there were.
And did you, at any point in time thereafter, as they were there in the Cop Theater, did you go and meet with one of them and say, you know, come with me to...
Objection, leading.
I will change that, Your Honor. Do you agree or disagree? Whether you went and summoned some police officer to go view the video?
I did not.
Okay. Why?
Just a lot going on that day. We were running around doing a lot of different things, talking to people on corporate phone, ascertaining the situation, going back and forth, helping guests, helping staff, keeping staff calm.
Well, but if you're going to view those surveillance films for something that is much less serious, right? Someone, stealing something from somewhere in the theater, or someone, violating some rule of bringing in their own popcorn or what have you. Why not do it for this?
There wasn't the timing to do it at that time. I was too busy doing other things at the time, so I wasn't going to sit down and watch a video.
Would you agree or disagree with me that corporate did not want you to turn over those videos to law enforcement?
They didn't want me be involved in it, no.
And do you agree with me or disagree that they made that clear?
I believe when I spoke to Jeremy Wellman, I believe that he said that let Seth Gordon deal with it and others deal with it.
Now, that day there at the Cop Theater, that matinee period, how many employees were there at Cop?
Being a Monday, probably, I would guess at this point, 12, 15, maybe.
12,
Tops.
15 employees.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, you became aware, did you not, that, agree with me or disagree, that Cobb Theater sent John over to that theater
Yes.
late that night
Yes.
in order to come and retrieve the hard drives from the surveillance system, correct?
That's correct.
And you agree with me or disagree that the instructions were that those hard drives...
Objection, hearsay.
Rephrase. Sustain.
Would you agree or disagree that Cobb Theater gave the instructions to fly those hard drives that very night?
Rephrase. Sustained.
Let me ask you a question. What did John Sillis do that night?
I wasn't there, but he came and removed the hard drives.
Objection beyond his scope of his knowledge. Hearsay. He said I wasn't there.
Sustained.
Now, was Cobb opened the following day?
No, we weren't.
Was Cobb opened the day after?
I think we were. I think we reopened 2 days or 3 days later.
2 or 3 days later.
Correct.
And so, sometime thereafter, did you go on vacation?
Yes, in March.
In March. And did you come back from vacation?
Yes, I did.
When you came back from vacation, was the same surveillance system in place?
Same system, new DVRs.
New DVRs?
Correct.
New hard drives?
Yes.
Would you tell ladies and gentlemen of the jury where the hard drives that were in that surveillance system were the day following?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. There's no predicate like that he has any personal knowledge of that.
To the extent he knows, overruled.
Where were those hard drives?
From what Fred Myers told me, they were shipped to
Objection, hearsay.
Approach. Mr. Escobar.
Thank you, Your Honor. Did you have some conversations with law enforcement that very afternoon?
Yes.
And do you have any recollection of those conversations?
No, I do not.
Are you telling this jury that if an officer had approached you to see those videos, what would you have done?
I would have taken them to see the videos.
You would have taken them to see the videos?
Yes.
Even though management didn't want you to do that?
Well, you asked me if they asked me to see the videos. If corporate gave me directions not to see the videos, then I would not take them, obviously.
So you would have to go corporate?
I would call corporate and say, hey, so-and-so may want to see a video.
Do you know if any other employee or manager had a conversation with law enforcement there? That day, that afternoon?
My projectionist, I think, would have. Our IT person might have, Eric Andrew.
Objections is all speculation.
Well, let me ask you this question. If those conversations had taken place, is there a procedure in place for them to call corporate as well?
Yes.
Did any police officer interview you concerning the contact that you had with Mr. Reeves there at the front counter?
Not that I recall.
Had a police officer asked you those questions, would you have answered them as you've answered them today here in front of the jury?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Ross?
Yes, sir. May it please the court, counsel. Mr. Peck, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Peck, you would agree with me, would you not, that the phone rule is relaxed during previews
Yes.
and it's strictly enforced during the movie?
Our
correct?
focus is on the movie feature.
Okay. And you would agree with me that that rule is on a case-by-case basis,
That's correct.
correct? Now, as far as theater goes, Theater 10, there's only one way into that theater, correct?
Correct. Yes. Door.
All right.
Or two doors, but one-way entrance, yes.
And is it fair to say that the goal of Cobb, or the goal of Cobb back then, was you wanted the patrons to have an Oscar moment?
Oscar-winning moments, yes, sir.
Okay. You indicated on that date, you saw yourself in the video, you were at the service desk,
That's correct.
correct?
Yes.
What were you doing at the service desk?
On a Monday, probably looking at our P&Ls, looking at different things on the computer, talking to guests as they come up, talking to different people as they approach.
Okay. You would agree with me, would you not, though? You weren't busy.
I mean, we weren't that busy, no, at that
Right.
moment, no.
And in fact, during that time period, you were having trouble with the sink upstairs, were you not?
I believe so, yeah. Yes.
And then a young lady, Miss Simpson, came in, correct?
Correct.
She was asking you for posters, right?
Yes.
And we even see you grab a pad and a pen, and I think you indicated, okay, write them down, the ones that you're looking for, correct?
Correct.
As you're doing so, you would agree with me that Mr. Reeves comes up,
Yes.
right? And you would agree with me also that he never exhibited any type of urgency, correct?
Yes.
He never said, excuse me, ma'am, but I need to talk to the general manager or the manager right away. I've got an urgent matter, right?
Yes.
And in fact, when he spoke to you, he never used the F word, did he, Mr. Reeves?
Not that I recall.
Okay, if he had, you would have remembered it, right?
I would think so, yes.
That's something you would definitely remember, correct?
I would think so, yes.
All right? I mean, it's not every day that there's a shooting in your movie theater, correct?
It's correct.
And in fact, you indicated to Mr. Escobar, you do not recall a lot of the events, correct?
Correct.
You would agree with me, Mr. Peck, that you were sued personally as a result of this?
Yes.
May I have a moment, Judge?
You may.
Your Honor, I don't have any further questions, Mr. Peck.
Thank you. Redirect.
Mr. Peck, you agree or disagree that the announcement that comes on before the previews to turn your cell phones off and put them away apply to both the previews and the movie?
Yes.
And you would agree with me, would you not, agree or disagree, that you enforce that rule for previews and movies, correct?
Yes, we try to.
You agree with me or disagree that you don't tell the patrons as they're coming in, hey, listen, phone use in the previews are okay.
That's correct.
So are you telling this jury then that it is okay?
Objection, leading.
Do you agree or disagree?
Sustained.
Do you agree or disagree that based upon the rules that were in place on January the 13th of 2014, that the minute that announcement comes on, it was telling your patrons to turn off their phones?
Yes, I would agree. It's telling them to turn off the phones.
And your ushers monitor that period of time after the announcement is made to make sure that the theater experience is preserved, correct?
Yes.
So when you said on cross-examination that that announcement did not pertain, was not enforced during the previews, that was not correct.
No, what I said is we're a little more relaxed during the previews.
Well, did you tell your patrons when they first came into the theater that your rules are more relaxed during the previews?
No.
I have no further questions.
May this witness be released?
Yes, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Peck. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's take a 10-minute recess. Ladies and gentlemen, remember my instructions during the break, and you're going to head back to the jury pool room. Just be ready in 10 minutes. Thank you.
I'll ask for the recess in 10 minutes.
Yes?
Bruce may be seated. Here's our President accounted for, Your Honor.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Were you all able to abide by my instructions during the recess? All right. Then we'll begin. Mr. Michaels?
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Bernard Adams.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was trying to, let's go this way, sir. So you don't mind. Right here, raise your right hand. You're going to face the clerk. She's going to
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Michaels.
Thank you, Judge. Please state your name.
My name is Bernard Adams.
Could you spell your first name for the court reporter, please?
That's Vernard.
And what is your profession?
I'm a consulting forensic pathologist.
Okay, so you're a medical doctor.
I am.
Let's talk a little bit about your education. Before I go over some of your background and qualifications, and Your Honor, I've shown this to the state. They don't have an objection. This is the defense exhibit marked M. I'm going to approach the witness and leave it there with the court's permission.
You may.
We're not offering to enter this into evidence.
Right. Okay.
Recognize that?
I do.
Okay, what is that?
My curriculum vitae.
Okay, will that help you go over some of the details of your long career?
If you get into enough detail, yes.
Okay, let's start out with your bachelor's degree. Where is that from?
The University of Maine at Orono,
And what year did you graduate?
1975.
And did you have were you recognized with any distinctions or honors that speak to your academic excellence?
Uh,
At this time, the state will stipulate that he qualifies to testify in the areas that I know
what you're testifying, and he may render his opinion.
And I appreciate that. We're still going to go into the background.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Any honors?
Yeah, Phi Beta Kappa, Phi Kappa Phi, and the degree was with highest distinction and high honors. I did have to refer to that.
Okay. Well, it's 75. So let's go to your medical doctor. Where did you go to medical school?
Tufts,
And where's that?
Boston,
When did you graduate?
1979.
Now let's talk about any sort of residency or fellowship training you did.
Okay. Out of medical school, my first year of residency training was in anatomic pathology at the New England Medical Center, which is now known as the Tufts Medical Center.
What's anatomic pathology?
Anatomic pathology encompasses the work that pathologists do in a hospital, including mostly reading surgical biopsies under the microscope, doing pap smear readings, and the occasional autopsy in a hospital.
Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm honest, but there's a lot of artifacts in the middle of the courtroom, plus to the side. I'm just trying to figure out where I can move so I can see the witness. So may I just figure that out?
Can this be moved back anywhere until he's ready to use it?
It's this gentleman here. I'm trying to just move around him, but then I don't want to approach on this desk bar either.
Is that any better?
He's got clear view.
You're from there.
Your Honor, the jurors are asking, can we turn off the white screen until we need it?
Oh, I thought it was off already.
No.
Turn it off, please,
Thank
thank you. All right, are we good? Thank you.
No, until we need you. Is that a little better, Mr. Martin?
I appreciate the accommodation. Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about board certifications.
We were in the middle of residency training and didn't finish that. Did you want to skip the rest of it or go on to?
I didn't. I was interrupted and lost my train of questioning. Let's talk about residency and training.
Okay. After that year at the New England Medical Center, I went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and did 2 years of anatomic pathology and 2 years of clinical pathology.
Okay. And after that?
After that, I went to Miami and did a year of forensic pathology at the Dade County Medical Examiner Office. It was known as Dade County back then. I still call it that.
Now it's called Miami-Dade County.
Yes.
What about any board certifications? That's where we were going.
I'm board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology and in forensic pathology.
Now let's talk about some of your positions that you've held in terms of employment, professorships, employment as a pathologist or medical doctor.
Okay. After I finished training, I took a position as a medical examiner in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, working principally in Worcester, Massachusetts, based at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, and occasionally in Boston. After 2 years of that, I went to Suffolk County, Long Island, which is the eastern 2/3 or 3/4 of Long Island, New York, and was a deputy medical examiner there for, as I recall, just under 2 years. I worked for Dr. Charles Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch was recruited to replace the chief medical examiner in New York City, and I went with him to New York City and worked in the Manhattan office for just over 2 years. And at that time, I had a faculty appointment at New York University, which was an affiliate of the medical examiner office. After that, I took a position as chief medical examiner in Hillsborough County, Florida, which, as you all know, is Tampa is the county seat, with a faculty appointment at the University of South Florida. And I stayed there until for 21 years, and then went to West Virginia University, where I was a professor of pathology and director of the autopsy service for 3 years, and trained the residents in autopsy pathology, as well as the pathology assistant students. WVU ran a school for pathology assistant students. I left that position after 3 years in 2015 and have been doing consulting for litigation attorneys since that time.
And are you still licensed to practice medicine in the state of Florida?
I am.
Okay. Let's talk about publishing. Have you been published?
Yes.
In what form?
Articles in medical journals, several book chapters, and I did one professional book which was designed to assist pathology trainees, fellows in forensic pathology, and how to write competent and cogent autopsy reports.
Okay, let's talk about some of the peer-reviewed medical publications. Okay, peer-reviewed means what?
Peer-reviewed means that the article was looked at by a board of review editors who then criticize, make suggestions for improvement before it's ever published, or they can reject the article.
And do you have your CV in front of you? Could you turn to page 6, please?
Yes.
Let's just talk about a couple of those. Number 1, what is the title of that?
Number 1 is called Trauma of the Pericardial Sac and Heart, an Autopsy Series. It's published in a journal called Academic Forensic Pathology, which was at that time completely online. That was in 2015. And I wrote that with Sarah Zidowich or Zidowich, depending on how you like to pronounce the name of that type. And she was one of the forensic pathologists that I trained in Tampa. We had a training program in affiliation with the University of South Florida. She went on to work at the Orlando office.
Okay, let's look at number 8.
Number 8, I wrote that with Claude Guidi, who is a radiologist based at Tampa General Hospital, and it's called Venous Air Embolism and Homicidal Blunt Impact Trauma, Case Reports, published in the American Journal of Forensic Pathology in 2001. Venous air embolism occurs when air gets drawn into veins and then collects in the right side of the heart and blocks the circulation. It's analogous to a pulmonary thromboembolism, which probably most of you have heard of as a pulmonary embolism, or PE, except instead of a clot, this is air blocking the flow of blood through the heart. Most commonly, the venous air is entrained in veins lining the skull. They're called dural sinuses. They're formed by infoldings of the dura mater, which is a tough, gristly-like tissue that lines the skull, but also has infoldings and serves to form veins in the skull. Because the veins are made of dura, they are not very elastic. They don't collapse when they're cut. They're stiff-walled. And so if there's a path for air to get in from, say, a skull fracture, then air can be pulled into the dural sinuses and drawn into the heart. And so those case reports involve that, and I had x-rays that we took at the medical examiner facility, and I enlisted Dr. Guidi to provide a professional radiology perspective.
Okay, so it looks like you have some 25 books listed there. We're not going to go through them all. Let's go to chapters in medical books and review. There's one guideline for reports, biopsy, pathologist.
First, I just need to...
Yes.
Okay, and let's just move on past those books and those sort of things, but you also authored chapters in books that deal with the practice of autopsy, correct? For the handbook of autopsy practice?
Yeah, I did some chapters in Ludwig's book, Handbook for Autopsy Practice. He was a mentor at the Mayo Clinic. And then the other one was the Spitz. It's known as Spitz. He's the senior editor, called Medical Legal Investigation of Death. And that was a predominant forensic pathology textbook in the 80s and 90s. And I did 2 chapters in 2 editions of that.
And were you also involved in practice guidelines for Florida medical examiners?
Yes,
That's over a period of years, correct?
yes.
In addition, you have numerous presentations that you've been involved with, correct?
At professional societies, yes, a few, yeah,
Lectures as well.
yes.
Now, in this particular, let me ask you this, have you ever been qualified as an expert in the field of pathology and the field of medicine?
I've been qualified as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Okay, and how many times?
Over 300, could be 400. I never kept count, so that's an estimate.
In state and federal court?
Yes.
And how many autopsies do you think in your career that you have performed?
That I have counted. It's 6,800.
What percentage do you think of those were as a result of gunshot wounds?
Well, let's do it this way. About 10% were homicides, and most of the homicides, probably 2/3, were from firearms. And then there are accidents. There aren't that many accidental firearm deaths. There are a few hunting accidents. And then there are suicides, almost all of which, if they involve firearms, involve handguns, but some long guns. Suicides would be about maybe 25% of a medical examiner practice, and the firearms deaths and suicides would be maybe half that amount in Florida. So what that all totals up to, I don't know.
When you say homicide, that's opposed to suicide or accident. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I use that in the sense that we use it on a death certificate, where those terms are intended solely as an aid to the vital statistics people who have to classify causes of death. And those designations are only to assist in figuring out the cause of death when the cause of death is not expressed correctly on the certificate. They have other questions of a similar ilk, such as, did the decedent smoke? Where did the injury occur? And that sort of thing, all designed to help them deal with causes of death that aren't written quite the way they should be.
In other words, my question to you is, the medical examiner, if they put the cause of death is homicide, they certainly aren't commenting on whether that homicide was justifiable or not.
No, and it's not even binding on anybody. It's not binding on a court. It's not binding on any lawyers. It's not even binding on the Register of Vital Statistics in Jacksonville. Why the Register of Vital Statistics for the state is in Jacksonville and not Tallahassee, I don't know. There's a story there. I don't know what it is, but that's where it is.
Now, for this particular case, you were provided, for instance, an autopsy report of Chad Oulson.
Yes.
You were provided some photographs.
Yes.
Including the photographs of the autopsy of Chad Oulson, Mr. Oulson?
Yes.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to show you a photograph that's already been entered into evidence by the state. It's State Exhibit number 60. Mr. Funderburk, if I may?
Can I just stand over there now?
Yeah.
I just move this up just a bit, Your Honor. Not too far. Okay, we're ready. If you would, may I have the witness step down, please? If you would step down, please, doctor. Dr. Adams, here's a stylus. You want to indicate some areas that we're about to talk about. This is a photograph that's been entered into evidence by the state of Florida depicting an autopsy photograph of the right hand of Chad Oulson. You saw similar photographs in the ones that we provided you, correct?
Yes.
In fact, you've seen this exact photograph.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you, as we look at this photograph, we are looking at, that looks like the right hand, is that correct?
Yes.
Is that proper medical technology, or is there, terminology, or is there another name for right hand and left hand?
Well, probably in Latin there is, but I say right hand.
Okay. Now we're looking at something at the very top, this area right here. Assuming that what we're looking at is a result of a gunshot wound, what are we looking at in that particular area that is underlined in black?
The thing that you just underlined in black is the actual wound created by the bullet. It's gouging out a trough from the tissue of the wrist on the radial side. I'm going to say radial and ulnar. Radial would be the side with the thumb, and ulnar would be the side where the little finger is. So it's named after the bones in the forearm. So this is on the radial aspect of the wrist. And the other thing you see here are all these reddish purple, almost sometimes black dots
Now,
on the
before we
skin.
get there, let me ask you a question. The orientation of this photograph, again, assuming it is a gunshot wound, what is the orientation? In other words, where would the firearm be in relation to this hand, this photograph of a hand?
This photograph is taken so that the lens is oriented almost the same way the muzzle of the gun was. So that you're looking down the sight of the gun when you're looking at this picture. I mean, the picture, there could be other photographs that are taken on the other side of the hand, and that wouldn't be the case for those photographs, but it is for this one.
Now, you were indicating these purple-looking areas. Let's talk about that. What is that?
That's gunpowder stippling. That's caused by having partially burning flakes of gunpowder strike the skin. They can strike other things too, but in this case it's the skin. Some of them, the flakes stay in the skin. The more the body's handled, the more they fall out. And others, like these pink ones, it's just a little divot in the skin, a little scrape. By itself, it's non-specific, but you can judge it by the company it keeps. This pattern is one of gunpowder stippling. The gunpowder stippling effect like this, where you see stippling but no soot, is typically for a standard handgun anywhere from 2 to 18 inches from the muzzle.
Now, let's talk about, you said no soot. What would soot be an indication of?
Soot is deposited when the skin is within a couple of inches of the muzzle. Beyond that, the soot doesn't. It's not apparent.
So the range between the muzzle, which is what, the very tip of the firearm,
Right.
to the wound itself, based on the stippling, is what's the range again?
Somewhere between 2 and 18 inches. This is moderately dense, so it's somewhere in the middle of that range. It's probably not out to 18 inches, and it's probably not 2 inches.
And what else does this kind of grouping of stippling tell us in terms of location of the firearm? In other words, my question is, why do I see more stippling in this area that I've drawn a square around, and less stippling in this area where I've drawn a square number 2 around?
Those flakes of gunpowder come out in a cone, if you will, and more of them are close to the center of the cone than to the outside of the cone. So you would expect more dense stippling close to the bullet, where the bullet goes, and it's a more dispersed pattern away from it. Now here, of course, this no skin up here, the bullet's grazing the wrist, and this isn't aligned exactly with the muzzle. You can see up here along the radial aspect of the wrist, you don't see any stippling, but if you took that hand and rotated it just a little bit like this, then you would have the lens of the camera lined up just the way the muzzle is. And you wouldn't be able to see this unstippled skin that you see in this photograph, because it's not exactly lined up. The lens isn't exactly the way the muzzle was.
Now, I notice way out here, put a little triangle, we see what may be a speck. As we get further out to the left, away from the knuckles, we see what appears not to, an area that appears not to have any stippling.
Yes, to the left of the triangle, no stippling. You can see some freckles. Within the stippling, within the triangle, you can see some freckles. And then you have this to the left side of the midline of the triangle. Is it a stipple or is it a freckle? I don't know. It's easy to judge it by the company it keeps, and most of these are therefore stippling. Out here, could be either one, because there's so little stippling out here.
Now, let's look at the fingers, what we can see of the fingers. Let's look at this finger right here.
Right. Mr. Michaels is pointing to the fourth finger and the proximal phalanx.
And
That's a word for the bone in the finger. 3 phalanges to each of the 4 fingers, 2 to the thumb. I mentioned that only for the record.
I appreciate that, and I won't remember what to call it again, but I appreciate that.
The court reporter will.
Thank you. And so I don't see any stippling there. Is there something that I'm missing? Do you see any stippling there?
I don't. It's a little bit in shadow, but it's illuminated well enough that you can see that you can't see any gunpowder stippling on the skin of those proximal phalanges of the fingers.
Now, based on the pattern that we're seeing of the stippling, if the fingers were extended out, would you expect to see stippling in that area?
I would. If you look at the way the stippling peters out here on the forearm, it should extend out about the same distance here if those fingers were in the line of fire of the gunpowder flakes. And we don't see that. So you can conclude that those parts of the fingers were not in the line of fire of the gunpowder flakes. Either the hand is flexed or there's something shielding the fingers.
And when you say flexed, are you talking about like closed, like grabbing something?
Flex means, right, the fingers are closed. My anatomy professor said the easiest way to remember flexion and extension is the picture of bear cub on a telephone pole. Everything that makes the bear cub hold on to the pole is flexion.
And would the stippling and the lack of stippling on the fingers be consistent with a hand that at the time that this trench and this stippling was created is what we see consistent with the fist?
It is.
Okay, thank you. You can take your seat again, please. Well, Your Honor, maybe not. Maybe we can use the demonstrative aid at this point. Can we turn this off, please, Mr. Funderburk? What we're going to do, Doctor, we're going to talk about some of the body's vulnerabilities. I have here a demonstrative aid, a model of sorts. Would that model help you explain to us the areas of vulnerability and why they might be vulnerable?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm talking about when we talk about trauma, blunt force or otherwise.
Yes.
Okay. May I, Your Honor?
Amen.
You can go down, please, Doctor. All right. Certainly you're familiar with anatomy of the human body.
Yes?
and the skeletal system.
Yeah.
You've probably seen it over the 6,800 times you talked about.
Some parts more than others, yeah.
I understand.
Right.
The most vulnerable part of the body?
Probably the head or the junction of the head and the cervical spine.
Let's start with the head. Tell us why the head is such a vulnerable area of the human body.
All right. I'm pointing to the temple here. And this part of the skull is called the temple bone. It's fairly thin there. So this part of the skull, being thinner than the rest of the skull, is more susceptible to impact, to fracture. And then the whole structure of the face.
So let's talk about the temple first.
Sure.
Okay. So the temple area is,
The side of the skull, just above and behind the eye socket,
okay.
the
And
orbit.
on the human body, it looks like this part here?
Yes.
Okay. And so this is what it looks like behind the face, right?
If you will.
Okay. And so tell me why this is particularly vulnerable in terms of fracture. Is it the structure? Tell me what it is that makes that area so vulnerable.
It's thinner than other parts of the skull. Other parts of the skull are thicker, not so much to protect from injury, but because they have muscular insertions. For instance, the masseter muscle comes up here and inserts. In gorillas, it goes up onto a crest on top of the skull because the muscle is so powerful they have to crack nuts. And humans, not so much. The skull is thicker back here. All the neck muscles are inserted.
Okay, let's talk about the skull in a moment. When it comes to the temple, based on the structure of the bones, by that I mean the lack of density that other bones may have, you said it's more susceptible to a trauma. Would that be a trauma caused by a fist that could potentially fracture the temple?
Could be a fist or a blunt object. Anything that provides impact.
Okay. Or even a slap that's done hard enough with the heel of the hand, for instance?
Probably not so much a slap from an open hand,
Okay.
because the force would be distributed. The injurious potential of something coming at the body is inversely proportional to the time over which it's inflicted and inversely proportional to the area over which it's inflicted. So if it's inflicted over a long time, it's less injurious, short time, more injurious. This makes sense if you think about the difference between blast injury, impact trauma with, say, with cars where there's conservation of momentum, you have enough speed, or just slow compression. Blast injury is much worse. Slow compression is much better. And then that's the time element. If you look at the surface area element, if all the force is concentrated in something small and hard, it's more injurious than if the force is spread out over a wider area. And if you think about a motorcycle helmet, it's designed to spread the impact out in time, that's the pad, the liner, and in space, that's the shell.
And so, for instance, if something that's a cell phone, if it were to strike somebody in the temple on the edge, is that potentially the cause of a fracture through that area?
Yes, it could be, yes.
Now, let me ask you this. If somebody's a fat guy, has a lot of fat, weighs a lot, is that going to protect him in any way from that sort of injury you're talking about when it comes to the temple?
No. I mean, there's a little bit of extra fat in the scalp of people who are obese, particularly morbidly obese people, but it's not much. Their increased fat depots are largely elsewhere, usual places, the abdomen, buttocks, to some degree on the extremities.
Now, I know you're talking about the face, what about other parts of the skull? Let's talk about that.
Well, before we leave the temple, I wanted to mention the epidural hematomas. There are arteries that supply the skull, and they run on the inside of the skull, between the lining dura mater, I mentioned that earlier, and the skull itself. So if there's a fracture and the two pieces of bone are displaced during the instant that the fracture occurs, then one of those arteries can be torn. The one most likely to be torn is the middle pharyngeal artery, which is right here in the temple region. So if you get a tearing of that artery, the person doesn't bleed to death. What happens is there's an accumulation of blood, the arterial blood gets pumped in, and it strips the dura off the skull, forms a hematoma, and then that dura, being pushed by the hematoma, presses on the brain. The brain doesn't like it when it's subjected to local pressure like that, and the brain then shifts. It can herniate through holes in the base of the skull if there's enough pressure, or the brain can simply develop swelling and edema in that area where there's increased pressure.
While we're talking about the brain, let me ask you this: as a person ages, does that affect the size of the brain within the skull?
It does. With advanced age, the brain actually shrinks.
Would it help you to be able to illustrate that for us?
Sure.
To explain it, Mr. Funderburg? If you would, let's draw nice and big so we all can see it, please.
I'm not a great artist, but I think this might help to illustrate it. So this is, what I've sketched is a coronal section of the head. The skull is this, is two black lines with cross-hatching filling in the space. The brain is this sort of U-shaped round thing in the middle with the dots. I tried to make dots.
Now, I'm sorry, doctor, when you said coronal, is that if we take the top of this off?
No,
We're looking
that
down?
would be a horizontal section. A coronal section is a vertical slice from left to right. So just imagine this is a vertical slice from left to right. If I drew a couple of ears on that, it might help, but I'm not drawing skin. And then the inner layer of the skull here, this black line, that's where the dura mater is. That's the lining of the skull. And then there's a projection of dura right here that is between the cerebral hemispheres. Not completely between, just part way. And that's just, the dura, as I mentioned, is tough, gristly-like, and it's flat. And then the veins that drain the brain drain right up into the base of that falx cerebri, which is that, it's called that because it's sickle shape. That's falx, Latin, I guess. Now, I'm going to sketch an older version of the same thing. And I'm going to just exaggerate. I didn't mean to make the skull thin here. You can ignore that. So again, a brain, the skull, and The space between the brain and the skull here is increased because the brain is smaller. And this space would be occupied by cerebrospinal fluid. Again, we have bridging veins going from the cerebral hemispheres up to the falx cerebri. And because the brain is smaller, those veins have to be longer. They traverse a longer distance. And tearing of those veins is the majority cause for subdural hematomas. You may have heard of someone elderly who fell and got a subdural hematoma. And that would be an accumulation of blood in the subdural space, where I just drew an arrow. And if there's enough blood, it will push on the brain with bad effect. There's more room to accumulate blood here before symptoms appear, but on the other hand, the bleed is more likely to happen because those veins are longer and more susceptible to being torn. What happens is if a person falls, I'm just going to draw a head in a couple of feet. I've drawn one stick figure upright and one stick figure supine or recumbent. And for the head to get from here to here, it rotates through 90 degrees. The skull and the brain are moving at the same time. The recumbent person has struck the floor or the ground or whatever it is. So the skull stops suddenly and the brain continues to rotate until it snaps back. That rotation is when those veins are torn. That's how a subdural hematoma works. So just to complete this, I'll sketch a child's brain. Almost no space between the brain and the skull. There's very little room for subdural blood to accumulate. They get symptoms right away, but they're less likely to have tearing of the veins because they're so short.
So as we age, we're in more danger. Should we be in a situation where either we fall, right,
Yes,
or are pushed down,
yes.
or go down as a result of a punch, for instance?
Yeah, from the viewpoint of the skull and the brain, it doesn't make any difference what the impact is.
Okay. All right, back to our model here, if you will. So we talked about the temple, about the brain. Let's speak a little bit more about the skull before we get to the face.
All right, I'm gonna check. Can we
Yeah.
Honor. If you would, please step down, Doctor. We were talking about the skull.
I was just about to move on to the junction of the skull and the cervical spine. I'm going to turn this thing sideways. And there are 7 cervical vertebrae. The one at the top is kind of like a washer, and the bolt for the washer is a portion of the second vertebra that sticks out. Reptiles don't have this arrangement, mammals do. If you consider the complete turning capacity of the head and neck, 40% of it occurs right here. That's why we can turn our heads like this easily, and why alligators look kind of silly when they run, because the head moves with the torso, because they can't turn the head the way a mammal can. So this is an area of weakness. It's nice to be able to look around without moving the whole torso. There's maybe some evolutionary reason, I don't know. But it's an area of weakness. And this comes to light in traffic accidents, where people get devastating injuries because the ligaments here fail, and this junction, the cranial-cervical junction, dislocates and lacerates or contuses or sprains the junction of the brainstem and the spinal cord. Now, if we're not talking about traffic accidents, and we're just talking about an impact from a blow of some kind, you can actually, a blow right here, and I'm indicating basically the mastoid process or the side of the upper neck, can produce enough transient dislocation to tear either one of the two vertebral arteries that run up through the bones of the vertebrae and then converge behind the brainstem, or in front of the brainstem, I should say. It can tear those and produce a subarachnoid hemorrhage, where blood fills the spinal fluid space around the brainstem and the spinal canal. And that can be instantly lethal or cause death within several hours. Or someone could survive, but this can cause a problem with just a localized blow. To the right side, I don't mean right in the sense of right-left, but to just one special part of the head, whereas the same force and the same spatial distribution of a blow elsewhere in the head might produce just a cerebral concussion or just irritate the victim.
We done with the head area yet? I know we haven't gotten to the face.
We'll turn to the face. I'll just turn this a little bit. The mandible is fairly strong, although there are some weak areas. The condyle will tend to fracture here. The other fractures tend to form near the canine teeth. But then if you think about it, the facial bones, there's this whole structure of thin bones enclosing air spaces, either the nasal passage or paranasal sinuses, commonly known as sinuses, that provide resonance for a nice speaking voice, or a nice place to create an abscess if they don't drain particularly well. We've all known people with a kind of sinusitis, which has been a big problem for them. But because these bones are thin, they can be fractured with some kind of blow to the face. This is the cheekbone here, the zygoma, and this can get fractured easily. Say, for instance, boxers or anybody who gets a blow to the face. And you can get other facial fractures. In traffic accidents, you can get a fracture right through the junction of the maxilla and the nasal bone, all the way through, all the way across, so that one part of the face is completely dislocated from the other part, transiently, with a tendon severing of arteries.
So the cheekbone, this area here, it looks like the structure is it's very elegant looking, but it also doesn't look very sturdy.
Right, and you just put your finger in the space where the masseter muscle goes.
Yeah. And would that protect this at all? This bone? were to
With
be
the muscle,
struck.
no, the muscle lies beneath the bone. I guess it would tampen that a little bit, provide a pad effect.
But it wouldn't stop this bone from being broken by a blow of some sort, including a fist.
No, it would not.
And when you talk about the jaw, again, that's vulnerable in terms of susceptible to being broken with a blow, including from a fist.
Right. And a blow to the chin can drive the condyles up into the base of the brain. That's something seen more in traffic fatalities where the force is substantial. And then there's the nose. The bones of the nose go right up toward the base of the skull. The base of the skull is quite thin there, so it is possible to have bony splinters from the nose be driven into the brain.
Teeth, possible to fracture teeth with the fist?
It is possible to fracture teeth depending on how well they've been taken care of, and equally likely to fracture the maxilla or the mandible.
But certainly, if, depending on one's bite, if one were to strike the right area, certainly you would chip or break a tooth that's maybe not directly struck. Would you agree with that?
Sure, ask any hockey player.
Okay. Where do we go to next on this model, doctor?
Well, we have ribs. All bones have some elastic fibers in them, so it helps the bone to bend when it's struck. Speaking of hockey players, you see them getting knocked down on the ice and they get right up. Their bones are bending and then snapping back. But they're young. In the elderly, much of that elastic component is lost, and the bones become more brittle. They don't bend very easily. And you see this portion here of the rib is kind of translucent on this plastic model, and this portion of the rib is opaque and white. This portion, the opaque white portion, is true bone. It's hollow in the middle, it's narrow to be sure, but it's bone. The translucent bit here is intended to depict cartilage. The portion of the rib that connects to the sternum in a young person is cartilage. So it's stiff, but it's rubbery, and it can absorb energy and release energy. These cartilaginous portion of the ribs gradually become calcified with advancing age, or even ossified, which means they actually just turn to bone. And with advanced age, the junction, the joint between the rib and the sternum can actually become fused. Ankylosing is the technical term, so that there's no joint anymore, and the joint doesn't bend. Rib fractures, of course, can be produced by a localized impact to the chest cage, the thorax. And
So let me ask you this. So an older person, you described this area here, I guess these areas, the translucent area
right,
of the rib cage as becoming ossified? Is that the word?
ossified, O-S-S,
And-
osseous.
And does that mean instead of being flexible and being cartilage-like, they get a little stiffer?
It gets stiffer, yes.
And are they more susceptible to fracture in an older person who has that
Yes.
condition?
So I was talking about rib fractures, and I was about to mention what happens when a rib is fractured. The rib fractures are painful, so the body tends to minimize the movement of breathing on that side. So there's less air moving in and out of the lung on the same side as the fracture. It's called splinting. Just as you can reduce the movement of a fracture of the tibia, for instance, you've got a proximal and a distal parts of the bone on each side of the fracture, and you want to align them and then immobilize them, and you do that with a mechanical splint. So the body tries to achieve the same thing by just not breathing very much on the side of a rib fracture. That's called splinting. And what happens when you don't ventilate a lung is that it's more susceptible to pneumonia. And if there's a lung contusion in the same area, that also independently increases the risk of pneumonia.
Where to next? The abdomen?
Well, let's talk about the abdomen. The liver sits here. It's part of the peritoneal cavity, so it's an abdominal organ, accessible by an abdominal surgeon. But the diaphragm, that big muscular slab, if you will, thin slab, that separates the thorax from the abdomen, it's domed up on both sides, and the liver sits up under there. So the liver, if you're not taking a deep breath, the liver sits up in the thorax from a mechanical point of view. And if a person takes a deep breath, the diaphragm descends because the muscle contracts, and the liver is allowed down a little bit. So if the abdomen gets a blow while a person has just taken a deep breath, then the liver can be lacerated. And the spleen, same thing over here, normally protected by the rib cage, but during a deep breath it descends and it's more susceptible to a blow.
Are we done? We have more
Well,
to go.
we can talk about the testes in a man. They're richly innervated, extremely painful when an injury occurs. And so a blow to the testes, for instance, a kick, in a person with heart disease, or even without heart disease, but usually with heart disease, can cause the heart to stop because the pain increases the sympathetic tone in the autonomic nervous system. Increased sympathetic tone increases the risk of a ventricular arrhythmia of the heart, either ventricular fibrillation or asystole or ventricular tachycardia. So a kick to the testes can produce instantaneous death. Not always, but it can do it. And it's been well documented.
Now, in terms of aging, you talked about how it affects this cartilage-like area in the rib cage. What does it do to the skeletal system in general?
In general, the bones become more brittle because they lose elastic fibers. And being more brittle, they're just more susceptible to fracture.
So an older person might suffer a fracture, or a younger person might not from the same blow.
Yes.
You can take your seat, though.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr.
All right, let's talk about the anatomy of a fist, okay? Why is a fist more likely to cause injury than an open hand? First, let's talk about a fist. What happens when you go from this to making a fist?
When the fingers are flexed into a fist, and the thumb can either be put in front of the fingers, which is what Americans think of as a fist, or in some societies the thumb is put between the fingers, but either way, when there's a fist, more force can be delivered with a fist below because that the kinetic energy is from the blow is being transmitted not only to the hand bones, but up into all the way up into the shoulder and even the torso. So the energy isn't all being absorbed by the hand, so more force can be delivered.
And what about the idea of the kind of the shape of the fist? We have, in layman's terms, knuckles, right? Are those more prominent when you make a fist?
They are.
You certainly have this area between the joint between the phalange as well, correct?
Right, there's a series of joints, right.
But these become more prominent and actually stick out when you make a fist.
Well, the key thing is that they're rigid so that they with a fist, particularly if there's say a roll of nickels or something, there's a slang term for that, I forget what it is. But this all serves to increase the buttressing effect of the fist so that everything's tight and solid, and these knuckles are not going to flex more or extend more. They're going to be solid, and the fist then becomes, for purposes of physics, one unit. Whereas if you have a hand, then you have all these individual bones and several units. The other thing that happens with a fist is that I mentioned earlier that if the force from a blow, it makes a difference whether the force is distributed over a small area or a large area. A fist delivers the blow over a smaller area than an open hand would.
Would you agree or disagree with me that the fist can cause a nose fracture?
Yes,
Can a fist cause a tooth fracture?
yes,
Can a fist fracture the squamous part of the skull?
the squamous part of the temporal bone that I talked about, yes, that's the thin part, with sufficient force, yes.
Okay. What about a brain contusion?
Any blow to the brain that's substantial enough can produce a brain contusion, particularly if the head is moving and the striking object is fixed as in the floor, but you can get the same effect with a moving object and a moving head. Really, there are very few situations where the head can't move. It's injurious to have a moving head.
What about a fist being able to cause a rib fracture?
It could, with sufficient force, yes, and an elderly, brittle rib.
Okay. So an elderly individual would be more susceptible to a rib fracture from a fist than somebody who isn't elderly.
Yes,
Now, certainly in your career, you're familiar with a one-punch homicide.
yes.
What does that mean?
That's when death is inflicted by one blow delivered by a fist. And I mentioned a couple situations when I was handling the skeleton. One is the blow to the side of the neck, causing a transient dislocation of the craniocervical junction and laceration of the vertebral arteries or branches of the vertebral arteries and a subarachnoid hemorrhage. That was described in a publication by Dr. Kontostavlos back in the late 80s. And it was called a Kontostavlos lesion for years after that.
You want to approach? Go ahead.
Doctor, certainly based on your years of education, your training in the field of pathology, your work in the field of pathology, you're familiar with that phenomenon of a one-punch homicide.
Yes,
And you're certainly familiar with the manner in which that happens.
yes,
Now, in this case, you had a look at the autopsy photo of Mr. Oulson's hand, and in your opinion, is the injury combined with the stippling consistent with that hand being in a fist when it was injured?
yes.
May I have a moment?
You may.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Adams. In your experience as a medical examiner, certainly you've seen police officers and detectives actually attend autopsies.
Yes, I encouraged it.
Nothing further, thank you.
Cross?
Can we resolve the,
Yeah, are we done with this?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to begin where Mr. Michaels left off. We talked about how the hand is positioned and what I think you referred to it as clenched. Is that the term that you used?
Well, I didn't, but you can,
Flexed.
that's fine.
Flexed? Is that the word?
I did
you
use the word flexed at one point, yes.
Okay. And yeah, you gave an example with the fingers into the palm.
One was the fingers wrapped, the thumb wrapped around the fingers, and one was the thumb between two fingers.
Okay. Now, you can use me as an example. When our hands are just hanging loose, are our hands straight out like this, or is it natural that they are curved?
I didn't understand the question.
Sure. When your hands are just naturally by your side, you're not moving at all, you see the position of my hands?
Yes,
All right. Is that just, as we're walking along, that's just the way our hands hang, right?
right, that's a neutral position,
Okay. I was looking for the term.
right.
So a neutral position is, that's why Lego figures look like this, I guess. They're just that, they're like this, right? They're just hanging at.
I don't know what you mean by a Lego
Well, you
figure.
said this is the neutral position, right?
When you said Lego, did you mean like the toy, the L-E-G-O?
Yeah, that one, that's the way their hands look.
Oh, okay, that's lost on me.
No, okay, all right. But the hands are in a neutral position. They're not straight out, right?
Right, that's
And
extended.
they're not flexed or clutched,
right,
right?
right.
They're in a neutral position, so just kind of halfway in between.
Right, okay.
Right. Now, you would agree that when we looked at the photograph of Mr. Oulson's right hand, that the hand in a neutral position would also place the fingers out of the cone of stippling that impregnated his back of his hand and his, is this the ulnar area that you called?
That's the radial side.
Radial side, right? So if the hands are in a natural position, the fingers would also be out of the cone, correct?
Well, I wouldn't quite agree with that because in the photograph where I pointed out that the position of the lens and the position of the muscle were almost the same, you could see the proximal phalanx of the four fingers. They were in view. That was a neutral position. Things to assume a neutral position after death, even though there's rigor mortis. So that photograph was a neutral position and there was no stippling on the skin.
All right, so I'm going to use my right hand here, right? And you know that the path was front to back, left to right, right?
For the wound path through the torso.
Right, and we have
not very much left to right, pretty much
Yeah.
front to back.
Okay, but as we move, then this is not going to be exposed, correct?
As you move what?
If you have, everything's dynamic, right? When you're shot, it's a stationary, almost a picture, right? But if our position can be anywhere before we're shot, so if it's a little bit front to back, a little bit left to right, if the hand is in the neutral position, as you say, then the fingers are not going to be in a position to have the stippling, correct?
Well, the way you have your hand positioned, it's a neutral position for the fingers, but they would be exposed to gunpowder.
The gunpowder is from here to here, correct?
In the photograph, right.
Okay, and there's nothing on the fingers.
So
Right.
something was either shielding those fingers, or they were flexed so that the fingers were not subjected to the gunpowder.
And they could be flexed in the neutral position, could they not?
Well, that's an oxymoron. They're either flexed, extended, or they're in a neutral position. They can't be both at once.
All right, so let's talk about in a neutral position. It's also consistent with being in a neutral position, is it not?
What is?
When the person was shot and the stippling that we see is also consistent with the hand being in a neutral position, is it not?
The only way to make it into a neutral position is to have the hand bent so far this way that the fingers are not exposed, and then the wound path across the wrist would then be angled. So it doesn't work.
the wound path is approximately right here, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so we have the straight line, right? So we have this that bends, right?
Yes.
Right? So if this is flexing and it's here, 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 it could be like that and still have the straight path, correct?
That wound on the wrist was actually a little bit at the base of the thumb, so it's, if you bend the wrist, the wound path, the area where the bullet went is going to move a little bit. So again, it doesn't work.
Page 1115. You remember testifying in a previous hearing?
Yes.
Right. And that time you were placed under oath
Yes.
and testified as you have here?
Yes.
Can you ask the question to give me a line, please, on that page?
Page 1115, line 17 through 25, page 1116. Lines 1 through 5. Now, we were talking about the stippling, and we've been talking about whether or not it would be on the fingers. And the other possibility is just the cone did not go that far, correct? The cone of stippling. It just didn't spread that far, correct?
No, we know how far the cone spread because of the spread on the forearm. So
Okay.
the only way for it not to have stippling at an equal distance on the fingers is if the fingers were flexed and out of the way, or if the fingers were shielded by an intermediary object.
At that hearing, do you remember being asked this question?
Your Honor, may we
I-
approach objection? Improper objection.
You remember testifying at a previous hearing?
Yes.
All right, and you were asked questions under oath,
Yes.
and you were giving your medical opinions during that particular hearing, were you not?
Yes.
And it's important, wouldn't you agree that that you provide accurate information to the jury?
Sure.
Now, before we went up to the bench, I asked you about is the lack of the stippling on the fingers, is that consistent with the cone of stippling not being that wide? And your response was that, yes, we know the cone of stippling because on the wrist. Remember that?
No, I don't.
That's
Perhaps you
what
can
you
show me
just
the
said.
transcript.
Huh?
I don't remember it, and maybe you can show me the transcript.
No, sir. That's what you just said 5 minutes ago. We know the cone of stippling because we can see it on the wrist, right? I mean, on the forearm. You just said that.
Oh, yeah, that, yeah.
Okay. Now, at that hearing, I asked you, all right, it's also consistent with the muzzle being at such a distance from the wrist that the cone is so small in diameter that it just didn't cover past the knuckles, correct? His fingers could have been out and stippling just didn't make it that far because it's so close. Answer, yes. Do you remember saying that?
No, but I don't dispute that that's in the transcript.
All right. Mr. Michaels went through a series of questions regarding the vulnerability of certain parts of the human anatomy, including the head area and the torso area. So I'd like to go through those with you, all right?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to use very layman terms. You can use the medical terms to put it in what I'm talking about, okay?
Sure.
All right. Now, I'm going to go through the injuries that you talked about, and I'm just going to bullet them out first, okay? And then we'll talk about them. You talked about the left and right temporal area, correct?
I did.
Where the bone is thin?
Yes.
Okay. You also talked about the orbital sockets of the eyes?
Yes.
All right. You also talked about the nasal cavity?
Yes.
And you talked about the cheeks where the muscles underneath the bone. Remember that testimony, that area right
Yes.
here? Okay. You also talked about the neck, not only the hitting in the side of the neck, and you used the skeleton to show how that can result in spinal fluid going where it's not supposed to be, right?
I did talk about spinal fluid, but I didn't talk about spinal fluid going where it's not supposed to be. I talked about blood going into where
Blood.
spinal fluid is supposed to be.
Very good. Thank you. All right. And then we talked about the jaw being broken.
Yes.
Okay. Now the witness step down, Your Honor.
May I, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes.
Object.
Okay. Okay.
Just a moment, Your Honor.
You may.
Just have a moment, Your Honor. When we talked about your previous testimony regarding the stippling on the hand, we talked about what you testified to at a previous hearing and what you testified here today. Let me just ask you one or two questions about that topic, okay?
Sure.
So
And
you know
I asked you
where
to-
we're going.
And I asked you to look at the transcript so I can see the context and not just the isolated quote.
Well, that, maybe your attorney would want to do that, I don't know. In that statement, you would agree with me, now that you've seen that statement, or that I've read it to you and you indicated yes, that the hands being in such a manner so that when the cone actually spreads, it doesn't hit the fingers, that is also consistent with no stippling on the fingers, correct?
Well, first of all, I don't understand the question the way you've constructed it. And secondly, you're referring to testimony in the transcript which you won't let me look at. So you can repeat it every time if you want, or you can let me look at it. But at this point, I don't remember the wording in it because I can't see it.
I read it to you. It was something about the words you didn't understand.
No, but I don't have it in front of me now. I don't remember exactly what the wording of the sentence was.
All right, I'll read it to you again.
Your Honor, I believe what I hear is that the witness is saying he doesn't remember the context, so if the prosecutor would be so kind, the court would instruct him to present it to Dr. Adams so that he can refresh his recollection. It sounds like that's what we should be doing here.
I'll agree. Go ahead and show it to him.
First witness, Judge? Just slide that over for me. Read page 115 and 116. Can I just stand here for a moment?
Sure.
Well, it looks like I didn't understand the question as you asked it. It
Your
was
Honor, I
clear at
object
this
to
point.
no, I object to the witnesses making any statement other than when I ask it.
All right. Fair
Okay.
enough. Ask a question.
I was trying to answer the question as to whether or not he
I
remembered.
haven't asked the question.
At this point, I don't know if there's a question pending. Ask the question again, please.
Did you have a chance to read the statement?
I did. I'd like to have it back so I can refer to it while I answer.
Did you have a chance to read the statement?
I said I did.
All right. And do you agree that's what you said at a previous hearing? That if the cone wasn't wide enough, that would be another reason for the stippling not to be on the fingers? That was your testimony at the previous hearing?
It probably was, although...
Excuse me, Judge, that calls for a yes or no. Was it your testimony at the previous hearing?
I did not review this transcript after
me, Judge.
the hearing.
All right. Just,
So if we assume the transcript is correct, that's an
just
assumption.
let him answer. Let him answer. Go ahead.
All right.
This is totally dependent on the accuracy of the court report. This isn't like a deposition where I get the chance to review it and make an errata sheet. I had no opportunity to do that, and I had not seen this thing until very recently. So I can't vouch for the correctness of whether this is reported correctly.
What's your hourly fee
$4.50,
How much are you getting paid to be here today?
same thing.
$4.50, what, an hour?
Yes,
And how many hours have you been here today?
I got here at noon.
All right, so it's 4 o'clock, $1,600?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
$1,600 in your pocket today. How many hours have you spent on this case prior to coming into this courtroom?
From the very inception,
Yes, sir.
I didn't look at the invoices, so I can't tell you.
Right.
Recently, just preparing for this trial, it's probably about 3 hours.
All right. And since the inception of this trial, how much have you been paid?
I don't know, because as I just said, I haven't looked at the invoices. I can't answer the question either for time or dollars.
All right. At the previous hearing, you would agree you were there about 4 hours also?
Sounds about right.
And prior to that previous hearing, you also had an opportunity to review material and fill out your invoice for that time?
Yes?
All right. So right now, we're at least at $3,200, another, what? Are we somewhere in the ballpark of what?
I don't know. What you say sounds good.
All right. And your testimony here today is, I don't believe what the court reporter wrote, therefore, court reporter must be wrong and not you. Is that your
No.
testimony?
I didn't say that. I said I can't vouch for the accuracy. If it's accurate, then it looks like I didn't fully comprehend the question as you asked it.
All right, let's talk about
Because my
that.
opinions haven't changed, and that
All right.
photograph hasn't changed.
All right, well, let's talk about that. At the time of the previous hearing, did you have an opportunity to say, Mr. Martin, I didn't understand that, like you've done a couple times here today?
I did.
All right, and in that particular section, you've read it. Did you say, Mr. Martin, I don't understand that question? You
I didn't
didn't
get-
do that, did you?
I don't think so, but I didn't get the chance to turn the page and see what was on the next page.
Thank you, no further questions.
Redirect?
Thank you, Judge. May I approach the clerk?
You may.
Exhibit 60, please. Thank you. May I have the doctor step down? Step down, please, Dr. Adams.
You may.
I'm sorry, Judge, I saw you shake your head, I didn't hear it. This is Exhibit 60, this is what we were talking about. You see this?
Yes, that's the same photograph, just a print form.
All right, now let's talk about this whole issue with testimony at the prior hearing. Why on this photo is it impossible that this stippling could have, the lack of stippling on the fingers was caused by having this hand closer to the barrel? What about the cone? What are we talking about here?
Well, the cone I mentioned is the gunpowder flakes issuing out, and not a cylinder, but a cone. It's the farther from the muscle, the farther they disperse, the wider the dispersion.
Let me interrupt you for a second. So the middle of the cone is where the bullet comes out of.
Yes, so the
So
flying
this-
bullet is surrounded by flying pieces of gunpowder.
So this injury right here is the bullet.
Yes, that's the center of the cone, if you will. And we can see here that the stippling extends out this far on the forearm. And if we take that same distance over here, that measurement goes out to the second knuckle of the fingers.
And if we had a muzzle that was closer, would we see the stippling out here?
No, the stippling would be concentrated. Those stipples would be closer together, but not spread out so much. Just the same number, actually more, because the gunpowder that didn't hit the hand because it went beneath it, some of that in a concentrated cone would actually be on the wrist of the hand.
And we don't know from what you read and what you were shown, what photos or anything else that were shown to you at that point to ask you that question, do we?
No, I couldn't tell from the transcript.
But looking at this photo, what you're saying, is it within a degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
You can have your seat.
More questions?
Are you done?
Yes,
I'll allow it.
When you answered the question at the previous hearing, was it also to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Everything I said in that hearing was to a reasonable degree of certainty unless I specified otherwise.
Thank you.
Just based on that, Your Honor, I get the last.
You do get the last word, your witness.
But again, in terms of the context of that statement, even whether the statement is accurate, that doesn't change your opinion today looking at the photo,
No.
does it? Thank you.
Will this witness be released?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you,
Subject to
Doctor.
recall, but
Thank you, Judge.
If you go, if you should get called back, you have to come.
Yes.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I don't know if you heard or not, I apologize, Mr. Escobar reminded me, I said subject to recall.
Right, I did. I told him
Thank you
if
so
he
much.
gets called. Yeah. Approach. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously, the attorneys and myself still, we have things to talk about outside your presence. We're going to do that now and let you go. Again, you're going a little earlier than I had hoped, but please, it looks like Friday's going to be our late day. So if you can plan on that, looks like that's where we're going to be. And it's not because we're ending early today or any other day. It's just, that's the way we've got witnesses scheduled and things set up. So it's going to be unavoidable, I'm afraid. But just be prepared for that, all right? Any questions? All right, if you would, please remember my instructions during the recess. Don't do any independent research or don't discuss the facts of the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Don't watch the news. Thank you. I'll see you in the morning, 8:30, or whatever time you guys have to be here.